There is a man in the Bible who never died. No tomb, no body, no funeral. One day he was walking the earth, and the next, he simply wasn't there anymore. His name was Enoch, and what happened to him still has no complete explanation 3,000 years later. Genesis chapter 5 is, on the surface, the most boring list in the entire book. Name, age, children, and a closing phrase that repeats like a heartbeat. Adam lived, had children, and died. Seth lived, had children, and died. ENOCH, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, every single one ends with the same word. And then the text reaches a name, and the pattern breaks for the first and only time in the entire chapter. Enoch lived 65 years and fathered Methuselah. Up to that point, nothing different from the others, but after that, the text changes tone completely, as if the narrator had lowered his voice. And Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. That verb, walked, doesn't appear with any other name on the list. It doesn't say Adam walked with God. It doesn't say Seth did either. Only Enoch receives that description, and only one other time in all of Genesis will that same expression be repeated, for another man, much later, Noah. And then comes the phrase that breaks the entire pattern of chapter 5. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. It doesn't say, and he died. It says, literally, and he was not, for God took him. No one else in that genealogy gets an exit like that. Everyone else dies. Only he disappears. 365 years, the same number of days in a complete solar year. No one knows for certain whether that's a coincidence or a deliberate clue from the original author. What we do know is that in a list where the other patriarchs live 800, 900 years, Enoch dies young by the text standards and disappears instead of dying. Why him? The simplest answer the Bible itself gives is that phrase, he walked with God. It doesn't say he built altars. It doesn't say he offered sacrifices. There isn't a single public deed attributed to him in the Genesis text. He just walks, like someone accompanying a friend, not like someone fulfilling a ritual. And that seemingly small detail is what seems to set his story apart from every other name on that list. There's another detail almost no one mentions when talking about Enoch. He is the father of Methuselah, the man who will live longer than any other human being recorded in the Bible. 969 years, the text says. No other figure in the entire Old Testament comes close to that number. For centuries, Jewish and Christian scholars have pointed out something unsettling about that figure. If you add up Methuselah's years of life from his birth, the year of his death lines up almost exactly with the year of the flood, as if his name itself carried a hidden date. And some ancient translators argue that the name Methuselah could mean something close to, when he dies, it shall come. The one who gave him that name was Enoch, the only man on the list who, according to the text, walked close enough to God to know what was coming. Outside of Genesis, the figure of Enoch grew in a way that surprises anyone who only knows the short version of the text. During the period known as the Second Temple, centuries before Jesus, a series of writings circulated among Jewish communities that we now collectively call the Book of Enoch. These texts never made it into the Hebrew Bible or most Christian canons, but they circulated with enormous force for generations, and they explain why Enoch's name remained relevant centuries after Genesis. According to those writings, Enoch didn't simply vanish. He was taken to tour the heavens, shown the storehouses of wind, snow, and rain, and the places where the souls of the dead are kept before the final judgment. He is shown, according to that extra-biblical account, the fate of a group of celestial beings who descended to earth, united with human women, and fathered a giant, violent offspring. That material lines up unsettlingly with a very brief and much debated line from Genesis chapter 6. There were giants on the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men. Genesis devotes only a couple of verses to that episode. The book of Enoch devotes entire chapters to it, with names for those beings, their oaths, and the punishment they receive. Enoch, in those texts, acts as an intercessor. The fallen beings ask him to plead on their behalf before God, and he goes up to deliver their message. The answer he receives, according to that account, is that there is no possible forgiveness for what they've done, and that the flood that will come generations later will be, in part, the consequence of that original corruption. In other words, the same man who disappears without dying is, in this extra-biblical tradition, the one who receives in advance the explanation for why the flood his own great-grandson Noah will have to survive is coming. No serious scholar argues these texts should be read as literal history in the same sense as Genesis, but their influence on ancient Jewish and Christian thought was enormous. And there is proof of that within the New Testament itself, something very few casual Bible readers know about. The brief letter of Jude, near the end of the New Testament, directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch about the Lord coming with 10,000 of his holy ones to judge everyone. It's the only time in the entire New Testament that a text outside the traditional Hebrew canon is quoted by name, attributed to a man who lived before the flood. That means that, for at least some early Christian readers, the tradition about Enoch wasn't a marginal tale, but a text with enough weight to be cited in an apostolic letter. Let's return now to the canonical New Testament itself, because Enoch appears there too, in a way that confirms his disappearance wasn't just a poetic way of saying he died peacefully. The letter to the Hebrews, in its famous chapter on faith, says that, "By faith Enoch was taken up, so that he would not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him." The Greek word used there for taken up describes an actual change of location, a physical transfer, not a metaphor about eternal rest. And that same passage adds something Genesis itself doesn't state explicitly, that before that transfer, Enoch had been commended as having pleased God. In other words, the author of Hebrews interprets Genesis's walking with God as an active relationship of faith, not just a biographical detail. This leaves the entire biblical tradition with, essentially, two figures who don't experience a conventional death within the text: Enoch at the beginning of Genesis and the prophet Elijah many centuries later. Elijah, according to the second book of Kings, is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, with chariots and horses of fire before the eyes of his disciple Elisha. The pattern repeats in a way that's hard to ignore. Both men walk close to God, and both are removed from the narrative without being given a tomb or a body to bury. Interestingly, centuries later in the Gospels, it is precisely Moses and Elijah who appear alongside Jesus in the episode known as the Transfiguration. Moses, whose body was also never found according to Deuteronomy's own account, and Elijah, who never died. Two figures wrapped in the same kind of mystery about their end. Enoch doesn't appear in that episode, but later Jewish tradition places him, alongside Elijah, among the few figures who would have entered heaven without passing through death. Some later Jewish mystical texts, already outside the biblical period, even identify Enoch with a transformed celestial figure, a high-ranking angel, though that idea was never universally accepted. The interesting thing is that none of these traditions, Jewish or early Christian, ever fully agreed on exactly what happened to Enoch at the precise moment of his disappearance. The Genesis text, for its part, remains deliberately sparse. There's no description of the moment, no witnesses are mentioned, just the dry phrase, "And he was not, for God took him." Some scholars have looked for parallels outside the Bible. in other cultures of the ancient Near East to better understand this figure. The Sumerian king list, a text much older than Genesis, mentions a king named Enmeduranki, associated with the city of Sippar, who receives divine secrets and becomes the founder of a line of diviners. Some researchers have pointed out structural similarities between that Mesopotamian figure and Enoch. Both appear in the 7th position of a long genealogical list, and both receive heavenly knowledge reserved for very few. This doesn't mean one story literally copies the other, but it does suggest that the idea of a 7th patriarch with special access to heaven's secrets had cultural roots long predating the biblical text itself. In Genesis, Enoch is in fact the 7th name from Adam, a detail early Jewish commentators, like Judah the Patriarch, already flagged as significant within the text's numerical structure. The number 7, throughout the entire Bible, is repeatedly associated with the idea of fullness, of rest, of something being completed. That the 7th man in human history is precisely the only one who doesn't die fits that symbolism in a way that's hard to dismiss as accidental on the original author's part. Going back to the Genesis text, there's another element that usually goes unnoticed. The name Enoch in Hebrew is related to a root meaning to dedicate or to initiate. It's the same root behind the Hebrew word that later gives rise to the name of the festival of Hanukkah, the dedication of the temple. Some medieval Jewish commentators, like Rashi, interpreted that name as a hint that Enoch was, in some way, an initiator, someone who opened a path no one had walked before. Other commentators, however, point out that the name of the city Cain built, mentioned a few verses earlier in Genesis, is also called Enoch, which adds an extra layer of ambiguity to the name's meaning. In other words, the same name carried by the man who escapes death is also the name of the first city built by a murderer, a coincidence scholars still debate without reaching a consensus. Let's return now to the central question this video has been building toward from the start. What exactly does it mean to walk with God? The Bible never offers a formal definition of that expression. There's no manual, no checklist, no ceremony described in the text. We only see it applied in the entire Old Testament to two men, Enoch before the flood, and Noah right before the flood begins. And in both cases, the result of that closeness is a form of survival outside the ordinary. Enoch escapes death itself, and Noah escapes the destruction that wipes out the rest of humanity. As if the text itself were suggesting, without saying so outright, that there's a relationship with the divine that operates outside the normal rules governing every other name on those genealogical lists. The early church fathers, centuries later, embraced this idea eagerly. Irenaeus of Lyon, in the 2nd century, saw in Enoch early proof that a human body could, in principle, be transferred into God's presence without passing through the corruption of the grave. That same idea would later become part of the theological foundation behind later Christian doctrines about the possibility of the body being transformed without prior death. It's striking to think that a figure who occupies barely 5 verses in the entire biblical text has generated so much theological discussion for nearly 3,000 consecutive years. And yet, there he remains, trapped in those 5 lines of Genesis, resisting any definitive explanation. We don't even know, with historical certainty, whether Enoch should be understood as a real figure in the modern sense of the word, or as a literary construction within Genesis's primitive genealogy. What we do know is that the biblical author deliberately chose to break the pattern he had established for every other name on that list, just for him. And that editorial decision, made thousands of years ago, still raises the same question today that it raised among the earliest Jewish readers of the text. If walking with God was enough for one man to escape the fate that reached every other name in Genesis 5, what exactly does that closeness mean? The Bible doesn't explain it with a formula. It shows it just once in the life of a man we know almost nothing about beyond a handful of lines. A man who had a son, gave him a name with a hidden warning inside it, walked 300 years alongside the divine, and then, without further notice, stopped being. There's no tomb to visit, no known resting place. Just a phrase, repeated for millennia, that still hasn't exhausted its mystery. And he was not, for God took him. Perhaps that's exactly why his story is still alive nearly 3,000 years after it was written, because unlike almost any other biblical character, Enoch doesn't have an ending. He only has an open disappearance, one every generation of readers has tried to complete in their own way. And maybe the most honest question we can ask ourselves today isn't where Enoch went, but why the text deliberately chose not to tell us. If this kind of biblical silence and mystery grips you as much as it grips us, this is exactly the kind of content we explore every week on this channel. Stories the Bible mentions but never fully explains, ones that have kept entire generations trying to decode them. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering these narrative gaps, and tell us in the comments, what do you think really happened to Enoch? See you in the next mystery.